So when we started looking at the Marine Life Protection Act initiative, we looked back at the Channel Islands process, what happened in the first two efforts to implement the Marine Life Protection Act, and we drew a number of lessons. First of all, the design of marine protected areas requires time, money, and data. And I'm talking about marine protected areas, but I think if you do any area planning, you're going to need all three of those. And previous attempts basically didn't look at those requirements. Secondly, it's very important to be clear about the role of key players. Who are the decision makers? What is the role of stakeholders? What is the role of science? That had not been really carefully looked at. Another element is at Channel Islands, there was a drive towards consensus. And consensus is a wonderful thing when you can reach it. But what had happened at the Channel Islands was that the drive towards consensus excluded the development of a range of alternatives that decision makers, the Fish and Game Commission, could entertain. Instead, the commissioners were presented basically with one very well-developed proposal and two rather poorly developed proposals. We decided that wasn't good for stakeholder engagement, and it wasn't good for the decision makers, who, after all, were the commission. The agency culture was also a problem because there was a resistance to engagement with stakeholders at a level of a dialogue rather than, thank you very much for your comments and input, we'll get back to you. There was inflexibility in the system so that issues would come up or situations would come up and there might be a need for a special meeting. Well, the bureaucracy just couldn't respond that quickly. And that was corrosive in many ways to the process. And finally, the integration of science. We all talk about it. We all think it's a very, very important piece, and it's very, very tough to do. So we really focused on how that could be improved. So in designing the initiative, what we did, once again, this is a big state, 1,100 miles of coastline. There are roughly 37 million people in California. Many of them live along the coast, but many live elsewhere. We decided that there needed to be statewide and regional perspectives. That is, the citizens of California needed to be represented just as the regional interests were represented. There needed to be solid information in science, and I emphasize information. Oftentimes you hear about science-based processes. Well, from our perspective, sometimes the science just isn't there, and you have to deal with the information that you've got. You've got information from fishermen, from divers. That kind of information has to be tapped. The process needs to be transparent. There was too much suspicion that was aroused by the way earlier processes had been carried out. Having worked in both the outside and the inside of agencies, it was my feeling certainly that we needed to be as transparent as possible. The process had to be supported professionally. That is, there needed to be professional facilitators. There needed to be analysts who were supporting. There needed to be GIS specialists supporting the work of stakeholders and not leaving it to the stakeholders to have to do it at home. And we were operating under a legislative mandate that had long been passed. The statewide network was supposed to be completed in 2003. Here we were in 2004 with step one yet to be taken. So we insisted on deadlines, and a lot of that was both from the political leadership, who didn't want a process that went on and on and on, but also from the foundation community, who didn't want to be caught in a situation of funding endless process. They wanted something to happen. We also decided on alternatives rather than consensus, that is, alternative ways of setting up marine protected area networks to present to the final decision makers. Don't aim for consensus. If you reach it, great, but really develop those alternatives. And then finally, we need to be adaptive. We went in, as Stephanie said, you could design a large part of this, and then the rest of the time you're adapting. And so you have to take that on right from the beginning. Now, in order to make this work, we developed a partnership. And the partnership supporting this process was between government agencies and the foundation community. And what we looked to from the government agencies primarily was their trust responsibility, their ability to enforce. That's not something that any of us could do. The legal authority to enforce and their expertise. The agencies have a tremendous amount of expertise. The private sector brings additional resources, and those resources can be used more flexibly, more responsibly. In the state of California, to get a contract through the Department of Fish and Game may take 9 months. And if you're on a process where you are having to go out and bring in expertise to a very dynamic process, you can't be waiting 9 months. You've got to be able to get that expertise in there. So there was an agreement that was developed, a memorandum of understanding with the agencies, between the agencies and the foundations. And even getting that memorandum of understanding established was a major undertaking. And we started off with a concept paper, trying to get clear among the partners as to what we were trying to accomplish before we turned it over to the attorneys to put it into legal language. But then we spent a lot of time focusing on roles and responsibilities. That's not only to help the partners understand what where the lines are, but so that stakeholders and others understand who's in charge of what. Okay. So the main elements of this were the Blue Ribbon Task Force, and this is a non-governmental group of experienced decision makers. We call it the Council of the Wise. These are people who don't have a dog in the hunt, so to speak. They are known for their ability to understand complex situations. There were 2 former mayors, a former chairman of the budget committee in the state legislature, 2 people from industry. So these were just people that immediately you look at them and you say, I would trust their judgment. And so that was one of the key elements, and their role was really to oversee this whole process. The second piece was a science advisory team, and that was a group that was selected by the Department of Fish and Game of scientists to support the decision-making process throughout. Then there was the regional stakeholder group, which I'll get into a little bit, a key element in the whole process. And then there was a staff. As I mentioned before, there was a staff that was supporting all of those elements. One thing I want to make clear is that this entire structure was meant to enhance the decision-making process of the Fish and Game Commission. This was not a rogue entity. This was meant to assist the Fish and Game Commission.